Dad. Dad. Dad.
The day of Edward Carter's funeral carried a silence that felt heavier than grief itself. Amelia Carter stood in black, barely processing the number of people who came to say goodbye to a man the world thought it knew, but clearly did not understand. Everything felt slow, stretched, like time itself had refused to move properly since Edward Carter died. And beside her stood Daniel Carter. But something about him felt wrong in a way Amelia couldn't immediately explain. He wasn't crying. He wasn't comforting her. He wasn't even fully present in the moment. It was as if Daniel Carter was physically there, but mentally already somewhere else entirely. Amelia noticed it in the smallest details. The way he checked his phone when he thought no one was watching. The way his eyes didn't stay on the coffin long enough to feel like closure. The way he kept scanning the crowd instead of standing still in grief. And then she noticed something else. Claire Moore. Claire was there too, standing slightly apart. Not close enough to be part of the immediate family space, but close enough to be seen. And every time Amelia's eyes drifted in her direction, she noticed something unsettling. Claire wasn't avoiding Daniel Carter, and Daniel Carter wasn't avoiding her. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. But to Amelia, something about their spacing felt intentional, like two people aware of each other without acknowledging it openly. Then came Vanessa Moore. Amelia turned toward her closest friend, expecting comfort, support, something familiar in a moment that felt like emotional collapse. But Vanessa Moore avoided her eyes, not once, not even during the burial. It was subtle but consistent, like she was carrying something she didn't want to be asked about. And that was when Amelia noticed something even stranger. Across the edges of the funeral grounds, two unfamiliar men stood apart from everyone else, not speaking, not interacting, just watching, not mourners, observers. Amelia tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself grief was making her hyper-aware of everything. But the feeling didn't leave her. Something about this funeral didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning she didn't understand yet. And then it happened. After the service, when most people had already begun leaving, Daniel Carter finally turned to Amelia Carter. His voice was calm, too calm, and what he asked didn't match the moment at all. "Did your father leave you anything?" Amelia blinked slowly, confused by the question more than hurt by it. She answered quietly, "No, he barely had savings." For the first time that day, Daniel Carter's expression changed. Not sadness, not grief, but disappointment, sharp, immediate. Almost like something he expected had just failed to appear. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once and walked away. And Amelia watched him go, not understanding why that moment felt heavier than the funeral itself. Because something about the way Daniel Carter left didn't feel like grief. It felt like confirmation of something he had already decided. 3 days after Edward Carter was buried, Amelia Carter received divorce papers. No warning, no explanation. Just the end of her marriage, sitting in a sealed envelope like it had been scheduled in advance. And as she held it in her hands, one thought refused to leave her mind. Daniel Carter hadn't left because of grief. He had left because he was already going somewhere else. And Amelia Carter was no longer part of that destination. The divorce papers didn't feel real at first. Amelia Carter sat at her father's house, still moving through the aftermath of the funeral in fragments, when the envelope arrived. No warning, no conversation, no final attempt to fix what had been breaking between them. Just paper, legal, final, cold. And the signature at the bottom wasn't emotional, it was deliberate. Daniel Carter had already decided. At first, Amelia tried to convince herself it was grief, that he was overwhelmed, that losing Edward Carter had pushed him into emotional instability he couldn't explain. But then she remembered the funeral, the distance, the questions, the disappointment in his eyes when she said Edward Carter had barely had savings. That moment wasn't grief. It was calculation. Because Daniel Carter didn't leave like someone who lost a family member. He left like someone who expected something and didn't get it. And then came the second shock. Claire Moore. At first, Amelia didn't even believe it when she heard. But then she saw it. Daniel Carter and Claire Moore together. Not hidden, not secret for long, just together, moving into the same spaces, appearing in the same places, building a life that seemed to continue seamlessly while Amelia was still standing inside the ruins of hers. The same Claire Moore who had stood quietly at the funeral. The same Claire Moore who had avoided her gaze, now inside Daniel Carter's new reality. And what made it worse was Vanessa Moore. Amelia went to her closest friend expecting answers, but Vanessa didn't give any. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. She simply stayed quiet in a way that felt heavier than explanation, and that silence started to feel like distance. Not physical, emotional, as if Vanessa Moore had already stepped out of something she refused to name. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter's behavior was changing in ways Amelia couldn't ignore anymore. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't lost. He was moving forward, fast, and strangely stable. New lifestyle, new confidence, new financial decisions that didn't match the man who had been struggling just months earlier. It didn't make sense. Until Amelia started asking one question she had been avoiding since the funeral. Where was the money coming from? Because Daniel Carter had not just left, he had upgraded. And whatever he believed he was stepping into, it started right after Edward Carter was buried. And Amelia Carter was beginning to realize something she wasn't ready to accept. Daniel Carter didn't just leave her. He left because he thought something bigger was waiting on the other side, and Claire Moore was already there when he arrived. After the divorce, Amelia Carter stopped sleeping properly, not because of loneliness alone, but because her mind refused to accept that Daniel Carter's behavior had no explanation she could see. Every detail kept looping back to the same unanswered question. What did he think he was stepping into? And why did everything change only after Edward Carter died? It started with something small, a drawer she had never opened in her father's study. Inside were objects that didn't match the image she had of Edward Carter at all. Old keys, unlabeled documents, a safety deposit slip folded neatly into a book like it had been placed there intentionally, not forgotten. At first she thought it was just old financial clutter, but then she noticed patterns, names she didn't recognize, institutions that didn't match normal banking systems, and handwritten notes that looked less like personal records and more like structured planning. Edward Carter had not been disorganized, he had been selective. The deeper Amelia Carter went, the more the picture changed. Hidden account references, layered business structures, connections to companies she had never heard him mention in life. And then she found something that made her pause completely. Repeated references to asset protection networks, not just wealth. Systems designed to hide wealth from observation. And suddenly, the idea that Edward Carter barely had savings didn't feel like truth anymore. It felt like a surface story, a controlled illusion. Amelia kept digging, ignoring the exhaustion building in her body, because something inside her refused to stop now. And that's when she found it. A partial breakdown of financial holdings tied to names she couldn't immediately connect. Until she saw the scale. Edward Carter wasn't just stable. He was operating at a level of wealth that had never been visible to the people closest to him. Billions. Not in a loud way, not in a public way, but in layers, structured, protected, delayed. And that detail changed everything. Because if Edward Carter truly had that level of hidden control, then Daniel Carter's behavior didn't look emotional anymore. It looked informed, and worse, calculated. Amelia sat back, staring at the documents, realizing something she had not allowed herself to think before. Daniel Carter didn't leave randomly. He left after Edward Carter died, after the structure became vulnerable, after access became possible, and Claire Moore was already too close to him at the exact same time. Nothing about this was separated anymore. Everything was connected. And Amelia Carter was now standing inside the beginning of something she could no longer walk away from. Amelia Carter found the envelope in a place she had already searched twice before. That alone made her stop. Because it wasn't just what she found. It was the fact that it hadn't been there the last time. The envelope was sealed, plain, and marked only with her name in Edward Carter's handwriting. No date, no explanation, just certainty. Her hands shook as she opened it, and the first line removed any remaining doubt that this was ordinary inheritance paperwork. If you are reading this, then I am gone. Amelia's breathing tightened, but she kept reading. Do not trust Daniel Carter. The room felt suddenly smaller, not because of fear alone, but because the name confirmed something she had been trying to avoid giving shape to. Edward Carter continued. Daniel Carter will move quickly after my death. He will ask questions. He will push for access. He will behave like someone trying to understand a situation he is not supposed to fully see. Amelia paused, because that was exactly what had happened. The funeral, the questions, the urgency, all of it. Edward's letter went on. But he is not acting alone in mindset. There are others who will align themselves with opportunity the moment they believe control is possible. Amelia's eyes slowed on the page, and then she saw it, a shift in tone. He was no longer just warning her, he was pointing. Someone close to you already understands more than they are saying. Her fingers tightened, because she already knew who that could be. Vanessa Moore. But the letter didn't stop there. And then came the line that made everything collapse into clarity. You will notice patterns, not in what people say, but in where they appear and who they appear with. Amelia's mind flashed instantly. Daniel Carter, Claire Moore, the funeral, the timing, the silence. Edward Carter's final line felt less like advice and more like instruction. And when you see the pattern clearly, do not ignore it. Amelia lowered the letter slowly, because now it wasn't just about grief anymore. It wasn't even just about betrayal. It was about structure. And Edward Carter had just confirmed what she was afraid to accept. This was already in motion before he died, and somewhere inside everything she had just read was a name that kept repeating in her mind without permission. Claire Moore, not once, not randomly, but positioned. And that was when Amelia realized something even worse. The letter was not the beginning of the warning. It was what was left after the warning had already started coming true. After reading Edward Carter's letter, Amelia Carter could no longer separate what she felt from what she was discovering. Because the letter didn't just warn her about Daniel Carter. It forced her to question how long Daniel Carter had actually been inside Edward Carter's world. She went back through old memories first. Small things, conversations that once felt ordinary, questions Daniel Carter used to ask casually, almost jokingly, about Edward Carter's work, his finances, his habits, his quiet lifestyle. At the time, they meant nothing. Now they felt like entry points. Then Amelia started looking at dates. And that's when the discomfort began to grow. Daniel Carter hadn't only changed after Edward Carter's death. There were signs of interest long before it. Subtle patterns, repeated curiosity about business dealings, unusual attention during family discussions where Edward Carter's name came up, and moments where Daniel Carter seemed more focused when money was mentioned than when emotion was present. But the deeper Amelia looked, the more unsettling the timeline became. Because Claire Moore wasn't just suddenly connected after the funeral either. She had been present in overlapping spaces long before that day. Not directly tied, not obvious, but always close enough to be noticed in hindsight. Events where Vanessa Moore invited both Claire Moore and Daniel Carter without much explanation. Gatherings where Edward Carter was present but didn't engage deeply with most people. And conversations Amelia never thought to question at the time. Now they looked like intersections, points where different lives briefly touched, without drawing attention. And Vanessa Moore, her role became the hardest to interpret, because she was always there, but never fully visible in what mattered. She connected people, she created proximity, but stayed outside the direct center of whatever was forming, and that made her silence more complicated than Amelia wanted to admit. Then came the most disturbing realization. If Daniel Carter, Claire Moore, and Vanessa Moore had all been in each other's orbit before Edward Carter died, then Edward's death wasn't what started everything. It was what removed the last barrier. The moment access became possible, the moment observation became action, and suddenly, Amelia Carter understood something she didn't want to believe. This wasn't a reaction to grief. It was a transition into opportunity, and she was now looking at a timeline where too many things lined up too perfectly to be accidental. Amelia Carter kept going because stopping now would mean accepting uncertainty forever. And what she found next changed the entire shape of Daniel Carter's behavior. It wasn't random, it was expectation. Daniel Carter had always believed Edward Carter was wealthy. Not modestly, not vaguely, but significantly. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of assumptions, indirect conversations, and signals he misread as confirmation. So when Daniel Carter married Amelia Carter, it wasn't just emotional commitment, it was proximity, access, a path towards something he believed already existed. But then Edward Carter never behaved like a publicly wealthy man. No visible luxury, no open display, no obvious signs of the fortune Daniel Carter assumed would surface. And over time, that created tension inside Daniel Carter's expectations, because he was waiting for something that wasn't arriving. Then Edward Carter died, and everything shifted at once. Not because wealth suddenly appeared, but because uncertainty became active. Now there was a will. Now there was a process. Now there was movement, and Daniel Carter moved with it, fast, too fast. Because in his mind the window had opened. But what Daniel Carter didn't know was that Edward Carter had never designed anything to be immediate. Everything was delayed, controlled, filtered through conditions no one fully understood yet, which meant Daniel Carter wasn't reacting to reality. He was reacting to assumption, and assumption had already pushed him past the point of return. Amelia sat with that thought for a long time, because it reframed everything: the divorce, the urgency, the emotional distance, even Claire Moore's increasing presence. It all stopped looking like separate decisions, and started looking like responses to a belief system that collapsed the moment Edward Carter died. And for the first time, Amelia Carter wasn't just asking what happened. She was asking how many years this had been building before she ever noticed it. After everything Amelia Carter had discovered, something inside her changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity, because now she understood something Daniel Carter never considered. This was no longer a situation unfolding around her. She was part of it, and she finally had enough information to act. Amelia didn't confront Daniel Carter. She didn't call Vanessa Moore. She didn't try to reason with Claire Moore. Instead, she went quiet, and then she hired investigators. At first, Daniel Carter didn't notice anything different. He was still operating in his new life, still connected to Claire Moore, still moving with the confidence of someone who believed he had stepped into stability after Edward Carter's death. But stability was an illusion he didn't realize he was already losing, because what Amelia Carter had uncovered was already being verified by professionals: financial inconsistencies, suspicious transfers, patterns tied to accounts that didn't align with Daniel Carter's known income history, and Claire Moore's name began appearing in places it should never have been. Not directly, not loudly, but repeatedly enough to form structure. And Vanessa Moore's past interactions created another layer of indirect connection that could no longer be ignored. Amelia didn't feel satisfaction yet, she felt focus. Because for the first time, she wasn't reacting to what had been done to her. She was responding to what she could prove, and proof changes everything. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter began to feel something he couldn't explain: delays where there used to be speed, resistance where there used to be access, silence where there used to be cooperation. And Claire Moore, instead of calming the situation, started applying pressure. Questions became sharper, expectations became more direct, as if she was trying to hold together something that was already slipping. And slowly, Daniel Carter began to realize something uncomfortable. He was no longer operating freely. Something was closing in, but he couldn't see exactly what, and that uncertainty was beginning to affect his decisions. Amelia Carter, however, was no longer uncertain. She was building a case, step by step, and every piece of evidence confirmed the same truth. Daniel Carter didn't leave her life randomly. He left because he thought he was stepping into something bigger, and now that belief was starting to collapse in real time. But what none of them realized yet was that Edward Carter's system wasn't just revealing what happened. It was still recording everything happening now, and the next phase was already in motion. At first, Daniel Carter didn't understand what was happening. Nothing looked dramatic, nothing looked final. But the structure around him was changing in ways he could feel before he could explain. Payments that used to move instantly began slowing down. Contacts that used to respond quickly started delaying replies. Deals that once felt secure suddenly needed review, and for Daniel Carter, that was the first crack. Because his entire confidence after leaving Amelia Carter was built on one assumption: that the direction he was moving in was stable. Claire Moore noticed it too, but instead of calming him, she started pressing harder. She asked questions Daniel Carter didn't have clear answers for anymore: where certain funds were being held, why transfers were being flagged, why names linked to old financial pathways were suddenly being questioned. And each question made Daniel Carter more tense. Not because of what she was asking, but because he didn't like that he didn't know. Meanwhile, Amelia Carter's investigation had already moved beyond suspicion. It was now confirmation. Patterns were no longer scattered. They were aligned. Financial behavior tied to Daniel Carter showed structured movement after Edward Carter's death, not emotional chaos. There were timing overlaps, transactional clusters, and indirect links that suggested coordination with external influence. And Claire Moore's presence was no longer just relational. It was operational, not in a loud way, but in a connected way. Every step Daniel Carter took seemed to intersect with her involvement at key points. And Vanessa Moore's earlier silence now became part of the same pattern of avoidance that had allowed things to progress without interruption. But Daniel Carter still didn't see the full picture. He only saw pressure. And pressure without understanding turns into panic. So he started trying to stabilize things quickly, too quickly, and that's where mistakes begin to surface, because rushed decisions leave traces. And traces are exactly what Amelia Carter's investigators were now collecting. Back in her silence, Amelia wasn't celebrating anything. She was watching, waiting, because she could already sense the shift. Daniel Carter was no longer in control of his direction. He was reacting to it, and people who react under pressure eventually expose what they were trying to protect. But what Daniel Carter still didn't realize was that the system he thought he was entering after Edward Carter's death was never designed for entry. It was designed for exposure. Vanessa Moore didn't come forward because she wanted to. She came forward because she could no longer hold everything together. When Amelia Carter finally confronted her, there was no shouting, no accusations, just silence that stretched long enough to feel heavier than words. And then Amelia asked the question that had been building since the funeral. What did you know? Vanessa didn't answer immediately. Her eyes dropped, not in guilt exactly, but in exhaustion. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't carry defense. It carried fracture. She admitted that things had started earlier than Amelia realized, not in action, but in awareness. She said Claire Moore had always been closer to Daniel Carter than she had admitted, not openly, not clearly, but present in ways Vanessa had seen and ignored, because it was easier not to question it. She also admitted something more painful. There were moments, small ones, where Daniel Carter's behavior around Edward Carter's estate made her uncomfortable. Questions that felt too precise, interest that felt too focused, but she dismissed it, told herself it was nothing, told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. And that silence, she said, was what haunted her most, because Edward Carter had noticed too. Vanessa revealed that Edward Carter had begun adjusting parts of his estate planning before his death, quietly, carefully, not to change what was coming, but to control how it would be revealed. And then came the part Vanessa struggled to say. Edward Carter had sensed interest around his financial structure from people close to the family. Not strangers, people inside the circle, and he had documented it not emotionally, not angrily, structurally, as if he was recording behavior instead of judging it. Amelia listened without interrupting, because for the first time, Vanessa Moore wasn't speaking like someone defending herself. She was speaking like someone realizing she had been part of something bigger than she understood. And when she finally finished, there was only one thing left unsaid. How much of this had already been set in motion before Edward Carter even died? The meeting with Edward Carter's estate lawyer changed everything Amelia Carter thought she understood about inheritance. Because what she walked into was not a reading of a will. It was a system activation briefing. The lawyer didn't speak emotionally. He spoke carefully, like someone reading instructions that had already been tested before. And then he revealed the truth. Edward Carter hadn't left behind a simple distribution of wealth. He left behind a conditional trust structure, layered, delayed, triggered by behavior, not time. Amelia Carter would not automatically receive anything in the way she expected. Instead, access to Edward Carter's estate depended on one thing only: exposure of interference. Any individual who attempted to manipulate, redirect, or position themselves around Edward Carter's financial structure after his death would be flagged within the system. Not by opinion, by evidence, and the lawyer slid a document forward. Names, not accusations, patterns. And Daniel Carter's name appeared. Claire Moore's name appeared indirectly through linked transactions and proximity mapping. Even Vanessa Moore appeared in connection logs that recorded behavioral adjacency, not direct financial action. Amelia went still, because this wasn't just about what people did. It was about how consistently they were near what was happening. The lawyer continued. If no action is taken by Amelia Carter, there is an automatic public release condition. Amelia looked up immediately. What does that mean? The lawyer didn't hesitate. It means everything is exposed: financial records, communication links, transactional behavior, all released through legal and institutional channels. No delay, no protection, no discretion. And suddenly the inheritance wasn't wealth, it was pressure. A system designed to force clarity through consequence. And the most disturbing part was not the punishment. It was the precision. Edward Carter had not built something reactive. He had built something observant, something that recorded intent through movement, and Daniel Carter was already inside it. So was Claire Moore. And Vanessa Moore was no longer outside it either. Amelia Carter wasn't inheriting money. She was inheriting responsibility for what that money revealed. And for the first time, she understood exactly why everything around her had felt like it was tightening since the funeral. It didn't happen all at once. That was the most unsettling part. The collapse of Daniel Carter's world began in fragments. First, a quiet inquiry from a financial institution. Then a delayed transfer that never completed. Then a message from a former associate asking questions he couldn't answer cleanly. At the same time, Claire Moore started noticing something she couldn't control. Her name wasn't being shouted publicly. It was being traced quietly, connections, overlaps, shared financial touchpoints that suddenly became relevant when viewed together instead of separately. And Vanessa Moore began receiving calls she didn't initiate. Not accusations, questions. The kind that made her replay every decision she had ignored. Meanwhile, Amelia Carter sat at the center of it all without needing to push anything forward, because Edward Carter's system was already doing it. The trust conditions had been triggered, and once triggered, they did not wait for permission. Information began surfacing through formal channels, not rumors, records, structured releases tied to verification processes that no one could silence easily. Daniel Carter was the first to feel the full impact, because the image he had built after leaving Amelia Carter began to fracture publicly. Financial inconsistencies were no longer hidden in private systems. They were now visible across institutions that no longer treated him as stable. Investors started pulling back. Professional relationships went quiet, and the confidence he once carried after the funeral started to erode under something he couldn't negotiate with: reality. Claire Moore tried to push back, tried to correct the narrative, tried to reframe her involvement as misunderstanding, coincidence, distance. But the system didn't respond to interpretation. It responded to data, and data was already locked. Vanessa Moore, meanwhile, wasn't exposed in the same direct way. But she was being questioned in a way that was harder to escape, because silence, when placed under review, becomes part of the record, and Amelia Carter finally saw it clearly. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even confrontation. It was exposure through structure. And Daniel Carter, for the first time since Edward Carter's death, realized something he could no longer avoid. He wasn't being attacked. He was being revealed. By the time the exposure had begun spreading, Amelia Carter thought she already understood Edward Carter's final design. A system that reacted to behavior, a trust that activated under pressure, a structure that revealed Daniel Carter, Claire Moore, and even Vanessa Moore through patterns they didn't realize they were creating. But then the final archive was opened, and everything she believed she understood shifted again. It wasn't just another document. It was a sealed digital collection. Videos, voice recordings, private logs. Edward Carter, speaking directly to Amelia Carter in recordings made before his death. And what he revealed changed the meaning of everything that had happened so far. Edward Carter wasn't just observing his family. He had been observing them for years, long before illness, long before the funeral. Long before any of them thought they were being watched in this way. He explained that wealth was never the center of what he built. It was the instrument, because what he had learned over time was simple but uncomfortable. People do not reveal who they are when they are comfortable. They reveal who they are when they believe something valuable is within reach. And so he designed a structure that would place that belief into motion. Slowly, naturally, without direct interference. Edward Carter called it controlled proximity testing. Amelia sat frozen as she listened, because it meant none of this began when he died. It began long before anyone noticed. Edward Carter's voice continued. I did not create this to punish anyone. I created it to observe what people choose when nothing is immediately stopping them. Then came the part that made Amelia's breath tighten. He had documented changes in behavior not just after his death, but during his final years, subtle shifts. Patterns forming quietly around him. Interest that increased whenever financial topics appeared. Emotional distance from certain individuals when wealth was mentioned indirectly. And most importantly, he had identified repetition. The same people appearing around the same triggers over time. Daniel Carter, Claire Moore, and even Vanessa Moore, not as villains, but as data points inside a system he was carefully studying. And then Edward Carter said something that stayed in the room long after the recording ended. Truth does not appear when people are asked. It appears when they believe they are not being tested anymore. Amelia lowered her head slowly, because now she understood something deeper than betrayal. This was never only about what people did after Edward Carter died. It was about what they had already been becoming long before he was gone. Claire Moore didn't collapse quietly. She fought back. Because for the first time, the structure around her wasn't something she could navigate socially or emotionally anymore. It was documented, and worse, it was already moving without her permission. She started with denial, then correction, then control attempts. Private messages were sent, old contacts were reached. Attempts were made to reframe her involvement around Daniel Carter as coincidence rather than connection. But every move she made didn't disappear into silence, it added weight. Because Edward Carter's system didn't just record outcomes, it recorded intent through repetition. And Claire Moore's repetition was now visible. Amelia Carter didn't need to chase her anymore. She only needed to observe what was already unfolding. Claire tried to separate herself from Daniel Carter publicly, but the timeline didn't support separation anymore. Their overlaps were already established through financial traces, timing patterns, and documented interactions tied to the estate's review process. Daniel Carter, seeing the pressure rising, attempted his own exit strategy, but it was too late. Because systems like this don't reset when people panic, they finalize. Vanessa Moore, caught in between, attempted to reach Amelia Carter again. But this time, Amelia didn't respond immediately, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because she could now see the structure beneath all of them. And Claire Moore realized it too, that the fight was no longer about perception, it was about documentation. And documentation does not argue. It confirms. In desperation, Claire attempted one final move. She tried to introduce counter-information, old claims, altered context, and selective truth meant to disrupt the narrative forming around her. But instead of stopping the system, it strengthened it, because contradictions only deepened the record. And that's when Claire Moore finally understood something she had avoided accepting since the funeral. This was no longer something she could influence. It was already decided by what had been collected, and what had been collected was everything. The final recording from Edward Carter didn't feel like information anymore. It felt like closure. Amelia Carter sat alone as the screen finally loaded, not expecting anything new, only expecting confirmation of what she already suspected. But Edward's voice came through differently this time, calmer, slower, like someone who had already finished the story and was now explaining why it had to end that way. He didn't begin with apologies. He didn't begin with justification. He began with truth. I know what you've seen by now. Amelia's hands tightened slightly. And I know it may feel like betrayal is the center of this. A pause. But it isn't, his voice continued. What you are witnessing is not people turning against you. It is people revealing what they were willing to become when they believed consequence was removed. Amelia didn't move, because for the first time, Edward Carter wasn't speaking about wealth or inheritance. He was speaking about human behavior, about patterns, about pressure. Then came the line that stayed with her longer than anything else. Money does not change people, Amelia. It removes the need for them to hide who they already are. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, heavy silence, the kind that doesn't ask for reaction, it demands reflection. Amelia Carter slowly looked down at everything she had uncovered. Daniel Carter's decisions, Claire Moore's alignment, Vanessa Moore's silence, all of it, and something inside her shifted, because she stopped seeing herself as the center of a betrayal story, and started seeing herself as the witness of a system revealing itself through people she once trusted. Not chaos, not coincidence, structure. Edward Carter's voice returned one last time. If you are seeing this fully now, then you are no longer inside it, you are outside it. And that means your choice begins here. The recording ended. And for a long time, Amelia Carter didn't speak. She didn't cry immediately. She didn't react the way she expected she would. Instead, she sat in silence, absorbing something heavier than grief. Clarity. Because everything she thought was happening to her had actually been revealing something through the people around her. And now, for the first time since Edward Carter's death, Amelia wasn't reacting to the past anymore. She was standing at the edge of what came next. The aftermath didn't arrive with a single moment. It arrived in outcomes. Slow, irreversible outcomes that unfolded across everyone who had been pulled into Edward Carter's system. Daniel Carter was the first to feel it fully. The confidence he carried after leaving Amelia Carter had completely eroded. The financial stability he believed he had stepped into no longer behaved like stability at all. It behaved like something being examined. Every move he made carried weight now. Every connection he tried to rely on came with hesitation on the other side. And for the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't chasing opportunity. He was trying to avoid consequences he could no longer fully see. Claire Moore's situation became even more isolated. The connections she once used as advantage no longer functioned the same way. Her attempts to reframe her role stopped working because the structure around her no longer needed interpretation. It needed confirmation, and confirmation had already been documented. She wasn't being spoken about emotionally anymore. She was being referenced structurally. As part of a sequence of events that had already been logged, Vanessa Moore ended differently from both of them. Not through exposure, but through distance. Because what she lost wasn't status or money, it was certainty. The belief that staying silent kept her safe. Now she understood that silence had simply delayed understanding, and that delay came at a cost she couldn't undo. Amelia Carter, however, did not end in collapse. She ended in awareness, not triumph, not revenge, awareness. Because everything she had been through, every betrayal, every shift, every unanswered question, had led her to a single realization. She was never just living through a broken relationship network. She was watching a controlled system reveal human behavior under pressure. And now that system had finished its work, Edward Carter never left behind chaos. He left behind conditions. And under those conditions, people didn't become different versions of themselves. They became unfiltered versions of who they already were. Daniel Carter didn't fall because he was exposed. He fell because he moved too quickly towards something he never truly understood. Claire Moore didn't lose control because she was targeted. She lost control because her actions were recorded faster than she could adjust them. And Vanessa Moore didn't break because she acted. She broke because she didn't. And Amelia Carter finally understood the most difficult truth of all. Sometimes the most painful part of betrayal is realizing it didn't begin when everything fell apart. It began long before anyone noticed. So the final question remains: if you had been inside that same system, would you have seen it early enough to act differently? Or would you only recognize the pattern after it was already complete? Now tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Amelia Carter? Would you have confronted Daniel Carter immediately? Or would you have waited and gathered proof like she did? And if you found this story unsettling, wait until you hear what happens in the next one. Because not every system is built to reveal betrayal. Some are built to create it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life, inspired documentary stories that go deeper than what meets the eye.